Okay, so now we want to assign our animations so that we can properly move our player around in the world and he'll actually look like he's doing some things. So what we want to do first of all is, now that we've finished dragging our sprites into our timeline down here, we can move our project tab back down to there like that, so that now we've got things a little bit more sensibly laid out and we can see things again. When we move that, we made some changes to the size of stuff, so we want to drag our inspector back in there like that, and we want to drag our hierarchy back over, so that we've still got plenty of space in our scene view and stuff like that here. Okay, so now we want to, like I said, we want to make some changes to our animation controller. So what we'll do is go up to Window here, and we're going to go down to Animator. And again, that'll open a new window, but we want that down here like this. Okay, so what we've got three different animations that we create on our player. We want to make sure actually that we stay selected on our player here. By default, it seems it's gone to that when we've opened it, but for example, if we were to click on something else, it'll stay open with all this stuff here, but if there was another animator that was active on something else, we'd move to that animator. So we want to make sure that we always stay on the active object that we're working on. Okay, so we've got our three different animation states here. We've got our walking, jumping, and our standing still. So what we're going to do is, first of all, we're just going to lay these out a little bit better. So I'm going to pull this walk over to the right here. We're going to put our idle up here, and we're going to put the jump down here. So at the moment, by default, because it was the first one we created, our walk animation is playing straight away. So that doesn't really make sense. So what we want is, when our player starts the game, we want them to be standing still. So what we're going to do is right click on our player idle, and we're going to set that as the default layer state. So the general basics of the animator here, these, like I said, these are the animations that we created, and we're going to work out now how to move between these animations so that we can make changes within our script, that we can tell the animator to change animations at the appropriate time. So for example, when we go from standing still to moving, and when we go to jumping into the air. So to be able to do that, we'll have to use some values that we can use. So if we click on parameters here, and we hit this little plus symbol, what we're going to add is, we want to know if the player, how fast the player is moving, basically. So we need to know if he's not moving at all, or if he is moving, then we'll start walking. And we also need to know basically whether the player is on the ground or not, and that's something that we added in the last couple of videos ago. We added the ability to check whether we're on the ground. So we want to be able to know whether we're on the ground, so that we know whether the player should be in his jump animation when he's in the air, or doing something else when he's on the ground. So we're going to add two little parameters here. So first of all, we're going to add a float, and we're going to call this speed. So this will be how fast the player is moving. And then we're going to go down here and add a bool. And again, a bool is just a true or a false variable, so it can either be true or false. And we're going to call this grounded, and that will be used to check whether the player is on the ground. Okay, so now that we have these two variables, we can set up how our animations will work with each other. And the way we do that is we'll right click on player idle here, and we're going to say make transition. And what that does is create this little arrow that we can drag around, and we want to click onto player walk, and that creates a link between those. So if we click on the link between them, if we just let it, there we go, it didn't come up for a second there, but we have all these options now of what happens when we create a link between them. So most important is our conditions down here. So these are the conditions of when will this kind of transition occur. So if we hit this little plus symbol, what we want to say is, if the speed, by default we get speed selected, but we can also go for grounded here if we wanted to. But so what we want to say is, if the speed is greater than, we'll say just 0.1. So if the speed is greater than 0.1, then we will go to the walking animation. And we can see a little preview down here. If we hit play, it'll just kind of show the new animation, basically, is what it goes to. We can do the same going back from our walk animation. So if we right click on walk and hit make transition again, back to player idle, we can do the same thing with our conditions. We can say when our speed this time is less than 0.1. So now when our speed goes below that, then we'll know that our player should be standing still. It'd be very hard to see a difference between when our speed is anything above 0.1 and 0, but just on the off chance maybe we might get a fraction of a second of a player kind of sliding a little bit when they look like they're standing still, and that can actually add to the game and make it look like they're kind of skidding a little bit. So you could even increase this value if you wanted to, but it's all up to you and how you want your game to work. So that's fine. And then we're going to look at what all this other stuff is in a minute, but we just want to set up our transitions first. So we're transitioning between both of those things, but then from whether we're standing still or whether we're walking, we want the ability to jump straight away from between those two things. So we want to say on our player idle here, we'll make a transition to player jump, and we will set on that the condition that if grounded is false, so if we're no longer on the ground, that means we must be jumping. So then we can go from standing still to jumping, but we also want to go from running to jumping. So we'll do the same thing, and we'll set when grounded is false, then we're jumping. But if we stop jumping, we know that we're always going to stop jumping by hitting the ground. And it doesn't really matter too much whether we send this back to idle or walk, because either way, if we send it back to idle, then it'll go, okay, we're idle. Are we moving at all? If so, we'll go to walk. And the same, if we go back to walk, and it'll go, are we moving? If not, we'll go back to idle. So what we're going to do is only make one transition out of this, back to idle. And we're going to set this one to be if grounded is true. And the reason we only want to make one as well is because we're only checking if the grounded is true. If grounded is true, and we were to make a transition back to both of these guys, then it wouldn't know which one to go to, basically, and we could end up with some errors occurring. And we don't want that to happen, so we want to make sure that we're just going out one way. Okay, so now we've got all our transitions set up. Let's have a look at what this stuff is up here. So we've got a little thing that says has an exit time, and if we drop the settings down here, by default exit time is 0, and that's fine, but we've got a fixed duration and a transition duration. And these are all things that we don't want on our animation transitions, basically. Because we're using sprite-based animations, we want it to instantly go from our player standing still to our player walking. Whereas if you were using, say, a fully 3D model character, you want it to go from standing still to, you want it gradually to move into the first position where the walking animation is occurring. Because your walking animation will be done in a loop, and if you were standing still and then suddenly clicking into a walking animation, that doesn't make sense with a 3D model, but it makes a lot of sense when we're using sprite animation like we are here. So what we want to do is make sure our transition duration here goes down to 0. So we want to set that on all of them, and we'll do that in a second. But the other thing we have here is a fixed duration, and basically what that means is the animation that this connection is going towards. So here, the player idle, it'll only it's telling that animation that it should only last a certain amount of time before moving on to another animation. And because we haven't set it up so that this animation knows where to go, we're going to start creating errors and stuff that we don't want. So what we want to do is turn off our fixed duration, and we also don't want it to have an exit time, which is, an exit time is basically how long our transition should last, because that's no use to us. So we want to make sure that we turn that off, and we want to do the same for all the other connections as well. So we'll go through them and just turn off the checkboxes and set the duration to be 0. Unfortunately, we can't actually select a whole bunch of them at once and then do it. We have to manually go through each individual one like this and set them all to be 0. So that's basically it for our animation controller. It's all set up for us now. Of course, at the moment, we still haven't told, our script isn't telling our animation controller when to make changes to our what animations we're doing at the moment. So that's what we're going to take a look at doing in the next video.